comes from the book of Job in chapter 8. If you're in your Pew Bible, that's page 797. Otherwise, it's Job chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we hear from one of Job's friends. His name is Bildad. Just a brief recap. Job is a man who is, relatively speaking, very righteous. Relative to the rest of the people on earth, he has lived a virtually blameless life. It doesn't mean he's totally sinless, but it means compared to everybody else, he's doing really, really good. And he has, initially, he was prospering. He had lots of riches and lots of family and lots of land and inheritance to pass on to those children. And God was bragging on Job one day. And Satan said, well, God, he only worships you because you give him so much good stuff. If you take away all of Job's stuff, then he won't worship you anymore. He won't love you anymore. And God said, oh, yes, he will. And I can prove it. And so God allows Satan to cause a series of tests to come on Job. And in the series of tests, he tragically loses everything that he has in this world. He loses his wealth. He loses his home. He loses his children. He loses everything. And for 7 days, Job is mourning all this loss. And his friends have come, Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar have come from far away, and they just sit with Job in his mourning for 7 days without saying a word. And finally, when Job speaks, he describes his lament, his torment, his pain. And the first friend to speak, his name is Eliphaz, and he tries to rationalize what Job's problem is. He says, Job, maybe you can feel better about all this if you can just rationalize it. Well, of course, it doesn't work. And Job continues to just pour out his anguish in chapters 6 and 7. And then in Job 8, where we open up today, the second friend begins to speak to Job. His name is Bildad. And Bildad is, of all things, an apologist. Now, that doesn't mean he goes around saying that he's sorry all the time. But what it means is apology in the classic sense of the term, a defender of ideas. And in this case, particularly a defender of God, a defender of the righteousness of God. Bildad is an apologist, and we'll see that in his words today as he tries to, quote-unquote, comfort his friend. But you'll see his words are far from comforting. Let's read them. Job chapter 8, beginning in the first 3 verses. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, how long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? Now, this is a man who's mourning, and he's spoken to in this way. That's not a really comforting words, isn't it? You're full of hot air, Job, is what he's saying. He said, you don't know what you're saying, man. Are you listening to your own words? Now, it's important to remember that Bildad is responding to something that Job said earlier. In Job chapter 7, verse 12, Job was complaining about the seeming unjust treatment that God was giving him. In verse 12, chapter 7, 12, he says, am I the sea or the sea monster that you set your guard over me? Job's contention is not that he's sinless, but he's saying, yeah, okay, God, maybe I have some sin in my life, but you're treating me like a monster, like the sea monster or like the wild waves. Why are you treating me so terribly, God? His claim is that God is not being fair or just toward him. And Bildad, being the apologist that he is, says, wait a minute, how dare you accuse God of being unjust? Now, we're at a tricky point here, aren't we? We know that Job is suffering greatly. And this is not a helpful thing to tell a suffering person. How dare you accuse God? But, on the other hand, Bildad's correct. It's one thing to be right about something, and it's another thing to be tender about it, isn't it? You can be right in a wrong sort of way, can't you? You know what I mean? That's exactly what Bildad's doing here. He's correct theologically. God is not unjust. But he's not being very helpful to his friend who is in grief and in mourning. So let's consider, though, because we are concerned with truth. Let's consider the truth of Bildad's claim, and I want you to put your thinking caps on. We're going to go to take a little philosophy class here for a minute, okay? And here's the question: a theology or philosophy class. Is it possible for God to be wrong? Is it possible for God to be unjust? That's what Bildad's asking. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what's right? This is a huge question, really, as we think about it, for our day and time. What do we ultimately appeal to be right, to be morally correct and just? And if you were a child, you might say, well, I appeal to my parents. My parents are the ones that I think are right. And then if you're a parent, well, what do? I never knew until I become a parent. You got to figure that out, right? When your kids start asking, well, what's ultimately right? What's morally true? I guess maybe you Google it. Is Google the standard of morality, perhaps, in the world? It seems like maybe it is nowadays. In the legal sense, in the United States legal system, you have a legal contention about what's right or just, and the lower courts handle it first, don't they? And then whatever the lower courts decide stands, unless there's an appeal by the plaintiff or the defendant, and then that appeal goes up to the higher courts, the federal courts or the state courts, and they make a decision whether the lower courts were correct or incorrect. And they either overturn the case or they confirm it. But then what? What if you say, well, even the upper courts, even they got it wrong? What's your final appeal in the United States? It's the Supreme Court, isn't it? And then whatever the Supreme Court decides is constitutionally and legally correct, however they interpret the Constitution, that is its interpretation. There is no other. However the Supreme Court determines the Constitution is to be read is the way that it is to be read, because there is no higher court of appeal. Their word is the final word on that legal issue. But when we're talking about morality, about what's morally true and correct, what's the highest thing that we can appeal to? What's happening in our society now, and you'll recognize this, is that we no longer make an appeal to anything greater than our own selves. You say, well, it seems right to me, so it must be. I think it's correct, right? And so, I think what you're doing is wrong. Well, why? Well, because I just think that it is. It's just me. It's just an appeal to my own sense of right and wrong, as though I'm the final court of all morality. Is that true, though? Am I the final court of appeal for all morality of all time? The answer, of course, is no. No, if our feelings about things were final and sufficient, then we'd have to say bizarre things like, well, Hitler must have been morally correct, right? Because he believed what he was doing was right. Is simply believing it, really honestly, genuinely believing something, does that make it correct? It doesn't, does it? Well, then what do you appeal to if you can't appeal to your own feelings about something? Perhaps you appeal to the society, right? Maybe the society is the thing that makes us ultimately know what's correct. Let's remember, Hitler was democratically elected, right? Even the society got it wrong, didn't they? Maybe you make an appeal to something even larger than that, and you say, well, in the end, it all works out. The Allies, they destroyed Nazi Germany and their Axis powers, and so might makes right in the end, right? Though the good guys finally are stronger and they win. Is that right, that the good guys are the ones that are stronger? I bet the people in Hong Kong wouldn't say that's true right now, would they? Is the Chinese government right just because they happen to have power and control and the guns? It's not true, is it? Well, then what's the final court of appeal? What can we finally appeal to and trust that it's ultimately right? And here's the answer: God. God is the final court of appeals on everything that is right and true and just, whether or not we personally think that it's right or true or just. God and His Word are the final court of appeal. God and His Word are the final court of appeal. So when we ask the question, is it possible for God to be wrong? The answer is no. God's words and God's actions cannot be bad or wrong. It's by virtue of Him being God. What He says and what He does is right de facto, because God is right. To say otherwise would be to assume that there's some sort of morality, some sort of standard that God can be judged by outside and beyond himself. And there's not, is there? There's nothing beyond God. So we say that God is morally correct. Jesus helps us understand this too, even in the New Testament. In John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. And that second claim that he makes, Jesus says, I am the truth. He doesn't say I'm living according to the truth. He doesn't say my life lines up with the truth. What does he say? He says, I am the truth. That everything that is true and right is in and through Jesus Christ. And everything that is outside of Christ is a lie. Is a lie. Jesus says, I am the very ground of truth. I am truth. So God will not and cannot stand in our moral judgment. We can't, and this is the temptation as Job is suffering, is to put God on trial and say, God, you're not just, but God cannot be unjust. God cannot stand trial. He cannot be unjust. But here's the thing. You and I will stand judgment, and we will be judged by his standard. We see Bildad elaborate on that even further. Listen to how difficult, how hard these words are. Knowing that, remember, Job's children were killed in all this trial. And listen to what Bildad says. These are awful words to comfort a friend. Verse 4, when your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Basically, Bildad's saying, your children were sinners, and so God killed them. And he was right to do so. And what are you going to say about it, Job? Are you going to judge God? This is the argument that he's making. It's a hard argument, isn't it? It's tough to hear something like that. And yet we have to sort of reluctantly say there's an aspect of that that's true. We're told that the penalty for sin is death. Even Job himself understands this. Look at, if you flip back into Job chapter 1 and verse 5, look what Job does before his children are dead, while they're still living. Look what Job does in Job 1:5. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Job thought that his children might have sinned. He thought that it was a real possibility, in fact. I mean, maybe he knew his children better than, he certainly knew them better than we do. And he says, yeah, they probably did something they shouldn't have done, so I'm gonna offer sacrifice for their sins. He knows that they're sinners. He knows that. And then look, even as when Job eventually responds to Bildad, we'll see this next week. Look at Job 9. In Job chapter 9, how does Job respond to these awful claims that Bildad lays at his feet? Job 9 verse 2, Job says, in truth, I know that this is so, but how can a man be right before God? So he says, yeah, my children were sinners, and they deserve to die, but I'm a sinner too, and I deserve to die. How can this be so? How can any of us be right before a holy God? Remember the rock's over here? We're way over here, and the holy rock is way over there. How can we be right before God? That's the question that Job is asking. And Bildad, believe it or not, actually comes with an answer, comes with the gospel, whether he knows it or not. So let's look at what he says. Verses 5 and on. But if you will seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. Your beginnings will seem humble, so prosperous will your future be. So Job, just like his children, Job too, just like us, Job is a sinner. Although he is a comparatively good man, he is a sinner nonetheless. And Bildad is saying in verses 5 and 6, he's saying this, Job, your children are dead, but you're not. The very fact that you're still alive leaves hope that you can still be reconciled to God. If you can plead with him, if you can come in honesty before him, there's hope that you can be reconciled and made right with God. And Bildad is right. And he's right in that regard for everybody in this room. While there's still breath in your lungs, while there's still life in your body, there's still opportunity to be reconciled with God. Sooner or later, you and I will stand in judgment. We'll stand before a holy God and have to answer for our lives. What will you say? I'm not talking about, all the good things. I mean, how will you answer for the bad things, the sins that we've committed? The things that you've said that you shouldn't have said, that you've done you shouldn't have done. Friends, God knows our thoughts. Let me ask you this. The things that you thought that you shouldn't have thought, how will you answer for those things? Here's what some people say. Some people say, when I get there, I'll say this. I was a pretty good person. Compared to the rest of the world, I was a pretty good person. And that might even be true. It was true for Job. He was a pretty good person. I was a pretty good person, God. But is it sufficient? Is it sufficient for a God whose demand is that we reflect His holiness, that there be any tarnish on our life? Here's what the Bible tells us in Romans 3, verses 10 to 11. There is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seek for God. Nobody on our own. None of us look for God. And we know that when we're honest. We get afraid sometimes of hell, or we long to have the benefits of this life, and so for various reasons we might seek out God, but none of us seek God for God's sake unless the Spirit draws Him. Some of you will say this. You stand before a holy God and you say, God, I'm okay because I was a member of Windermere Presbyterian Church. It was a good church, God, and I was a member there, a faithful member. I was a church member. Friends, as much as I am glad that you are members of Windermere Presbyterian Church, let me be really clear in assuring you that membership in this physical body here is not what saves you. Am I clear on that? This membership here, attendance here is not going to save you. Jesus says this about the churchgoers of His day: unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and of the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So how then do we stand before a holy God? Well, Bildad, whether he knows it or not, gives us entrance into understanding how that happens. Look at verse 6, in the second line of verse 6. And Bildad is talking to Job, and he says, if you seek God, these things will happen. He says, if you seek God, second line in verse 6, even now He will rouse Himself on your behalf, and He will restore you. When you stand before Christ on the day of judgment, I pray that you'll be able to stand there with an honesty and a sincerity of your heart and say this: Lord Christ, you are right, and I am a sinner, and I am justly condemned. That you can have the wherewithal to recognize that that's true. Don't try to justify yourself. You can't. Lord Christ, I am a sinner, and I stand justly condemned, and I have no plea except this: except that you roused yourself on my behalf. You roused yourself to the cross on my behalf, and you have been condemned in my place, and you have restored me. You see how Bildad, even unknowingly, already points to Christ. Even now He will rouse Himself on your behalf, and He will restore you. The only way we stand before God is when He makes us able to stand. And He does so, and has done so in the person of Jesus Christ. Let's continue on. Verse 8, ask the former generation and find out what their ancestors learned. For we were born only yesterday and know nothing, and our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not instruct you and tell you? Will they not bring forth words from their understanding? Here's what he's saying in essence. All right, Job, let's not pretend like you're the only person who's ever suffered before. Let's not pretend that you're the only righteous person who's ever suffered before. Let's look back and see that this has happened to generations in the past. This has happened before. Right? Let's ask the past. Let's see if this isn't something that's occurred before. That helps us sometimes to realize that we're not suffering in a way that's never happened before. Verse 11 and on. Can papyrus grow tall where there is no marsh? Can reeds thrive without water? While still growing and uncut, they wither more quickly than the grass. Such is the destiny of all who forget God. So perishes the hope of the godless. What they trust in is fragile. What they rely on is a spider's web. They lean on the web, but it gives way. They cling to it, but it does not hold. They're like well-watered plant in the sunshine, spreading its shoots over the garden. It intertwines its roots around a pile of rocks and looks for a place among the stones. But when it's torn from its spot, that place disowns it and says, I never saw you. Surely its life withers away, and from the soil the other plants grow. What Bildad is speaking of here is he's giving an extended metaphor, and he's talking about those who forget God or the godless. That's made clear in verse 13. Those who forget God and the godless. And what are they like? And he compares them to the papyrus. Now, I'm not an expert in papyrus. Maybe some of you are. But the papyrus plant, best I can understand in my looking into it, is a plant that grows up along the banks of the river. And in the wet season, the river overflows its banks, and the papyrus grows up really tall, 15 feet tall, taller than every other plant around it. And it grows up very fast. So it's a very strong, tall, fast-growing plant. And it's awesome to see, right? You see this papyrus grow up, and it's taller than all the other grasses. And you think, wow. But then what happens? Well, when the dry season comes and the river shrinks back down and the papyrus no longer has water, well, then all of a sudden you see that it withers faster than every other plant around it. It withers and it dies. And this is the way Bildad says is true of the godless. That they may seem tall and powerful and strong. They may spring up quickly and seem to be very impressive people among us. But what's happened is that they have forgotten God, the very source, the very river that feeds their roots. And when you forget God, what you see is that they will wither more quickly than ever before. This is what Bildad's describing. I want to take this opportunity to point something out for us in our country and in the time that we live in. We are seeing ourselves as a society, and we should see ourselves not necessarily as Christians. I think that pins us too narrowly, but we should certainly see ourselves as a God-fearing nation. As a nation that believes that there is a God who is ultimately judging the human beings. And I think we see this built into our documents as a foundational in feeding ourselves as a people. We believe that there is a God who is morally just at the bottom of all human interactions. Okay, we write these into our documents that formed this country. The Declaration of Independence says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. If we didn't believe in a God, then everything we've built would crumble, because it's built on the basis that there is a God who's created us and built certain things into us as humans. I was pleased to find that in the North Carolina Constitution, in Article 5, Section 8, there is a wonderful little clause in there. It says this: the following persons shall be disqualified for office. First, any person who shall deny the being of Almighty God. Do you know that's in our Constitution in North Carolina? Now, arguably it's not as enforced as it ought to be, in my opinion. But this is absolutely correct. For if we do not believe that there is a God governing human interactions at the very bottom, we become a godless nation, a nation with no morality whatsoever. There is no morality, no absolute or universal morality apart from God. There's only what we think is best. Right? No, there's no court of final appeal for morality. And if we're going to build a stable society, we depend upon there being a God. A godless society, by definition, cannot be universally moral. And so I would say this, that even though atheists make the argument that they can be moral, they cannot. They cannot be moral outside of their own opinions. I would say this, Christians, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you to vote Democrat or Republican, but I will tell you this as your pastor: be prepared to elect anybody except an atheist. Be prepared to elect anybody except an atheist. I'd prefer a Muslim or a Mormon than I would an atheist. This goes back to the term God-fearing. Are you a God-fearing man? Are you a God-fearing woman? That's not a throwaway term, right? It means that we fear that there is a God who we are ultimately accountable to. And if we don't believe that, then we have no basis to build not only our own lives, but certainly we don't have a basis to even build society upon. So, are you a God-fearing man? Be prepared to elect anybody except an atheist. Bildad says this of them, of those who are godless. He says what they trust in, this is true of our society, isn't it? Of those who are godless. What they trust in is fragile. What they rely on is a spider's web. They lean on the web, but it gives way. They cling to it, but it does not hold. We'll go on in the last verses we'll see today. Verse 20 to 22. Surely God does not reject one who is blameless, or strengthen the hands of evildoers. He will yet fill your mouth with laughter, and your lips with shouts of joy. Your enemies will be clothed in shame, and the tents of the wicked will be no more. The basic and final contention that Bildad makes here is this, that God is fair. And it's true, it doesn't always feel that way. We don't always experience that in the moment or even in our lifetime sometimes, but it's true. God is fair, which means if you are righteous, he will treat you right. And if you are wicked, he will punish you. These things are still absolutely true. It's called justice, that the bad get what they deserve and the good get what they deserve. That's just. God is a just God, but we realize in saying that we, like Job, like every person we've ever known, are sinners. And so justice is not always a good thing, is it? I know what people mean when they say, we want justice in society. They're thinking in immediate context. I'm a pastor, so I'm always thinking ultimate context. And when I hear justice, they say, I want justice. I think, oh God, I don't want justice. I want mercy. I want mercy, not justice. But I understand what they mean. God is a just God. But how can we sinners find mercy? How can we, if God is a fair and just God? Well, it's because of this, that God is also love. Not only is he just toward you, he also loves you, which is why he sent his son to die in your place, in your stead, to pay the just penalty for your sin. He did that. In Jesus Christ, God lived a totally just life, so that now his death justifies you who believe. You who believe in him, Christ makes you, well, just and blameless. You're blameless not because you have been blameless in and of your life, but because Christ has given his blameless life to you so that you can possess it and have it and live it. You're blameless. And the scripture here tells us, surely God does not reject one who is blameless. May this word be to the glory of God and for the joy of his people. Amen.